There's no philosophy without skepticism. Perhaps there are other ways of knowing than philosophical knowing, but within the practice of philosophy, we subject our apparent certainties to doubt. And perhaps even the majority of philosophers do this with the aim of securing their certainties, reasoning toward a foregone conclusion. But even the most dogmatic philosophy has to employ skeptical means, even if those means are merely a pantomime. The interrelation of skepticism and philosophy is obvious at the beginning of the Enlightenment, in Descartes' methodology of doubt. We can also recognize it in Socrates, the dialectician, who made the pretense of ignorance and operated by questioning his interlocutors about their apparent certainties. But if skepticism is often a means, then this does not really get us to the aim of philosophy, if I could be so bold as to suggest such a thing, if only rhetorically. We could consider Socrates as providing a possibility for the aim of philosophy. Socrates is concerned above all with the criteria for making distinctions, particularly distinctions of value. Socrates opposes any interlocutor who reasons in such a way as to make impossible a criterion for distinguishing between truth and falsehood, or between good and bad, beauty and ugliness, and so on. I think of, for example, the Cratylus, which concerns names or words. The central question of the dialogue in the Cratylus is there truth in names? Can the words we use for things be correct or incorrect? Socrates argues against Hermogenes, who argues that names are purely convention and custom, and then against Cratylus, who argues that all names are naturally correct and can't be used falsely. We can set to one side the intricacies of the arguments in this dialogue. What interests us here is the central concern of Socrates, the ability to establish a criterion. Names cannot be solely convention because that would mean that no use of a word is true, making such a criterion impossible. The same could be said of the view that all words possess a natural correctness, because that would mean that no use of a word is false. Both positions make a criterion impossible, and thus Socrates argues against them. And philosophy, in the general sense that we use the word now, comes into her own with Socrates, because his focus is moral philosophy. And I mean moral philosophy here not just in the narrow sense of ethics, even though that is the primary concern of Socrates, but in a sense contrasted with natural philosophy. Rather than an investigation of nature, Socratic philosophy is an investigation of man, the measuring animal. Socrates investigates how it is that we determine what is good or what is true. How do we make these valuations? That is to say, based on what criterion should we judge? We may not necessarily discover a criterion of which we can be absolutely certain, but the project of Socrates seeks, by means of skepticism, this aim of a criterion for judgment, deciding between true and false, even if the Platonic dialogues often end on a note of ambiguity. And so when we invoke the term skepticism, then, as a philosophical school, we're really referring to those philosophers who have not sought after a criterion of judgment. They will use the same skeptical methods, but all philosophers do this, so that in no way distinguishes them from the rest of philosophy. What distinguishes the skeptics is a difference in aim. There were many names for these philosophers in the ancient world. Sometimes they were called doubters, sometimes investigators. One of the names for the school of skeptics was the ephektos. This comes from the word ephektos, which is sort of the adjective form of epekian, which means to withhold, or to hold back, to suspend. So if one is ephektos, he is one who holds back. The skeptics were also known as the ephektics because their school was defined by this practice of withholding judgment. Unlike Socrates and Plato, for example, who have for their aim the ability of judgment. It seems likely that most philosophers at different points sometimes have to make judgments and sometimes have to withhold judgments. The difference for the skeptics is that withholding judgment is their hallmark, and they claim that they themselves assert no judgments, except perhaps provisionally, or perhaps to counterpose it with another equally plausible and yet antithetical judgment. This does not mean that the skeptics hold the position that finding a criterion of judgment is impossible. In a way, that statement would in and of itself be a judgment. And thus, the skeptics have often gone to great pains to demonstrate that their position requires no such judgment on the impossibility of judgment. It is only a practice of holding back judgment on all questions, wherever possible, even on the question of whether it may sometimes be necessary to make a judgment. But I think this underlying dynamic is what accounts for the strange and sometimes confusing relationship that philosophy has to skepticism whenever it is articulated as a school and not merely as a methodology towards a certain end. When we view the skeptic as the withholder of judgment, and the typical philosopher, the skeptics would say the dogmatic philosopher, as seeking a criterion of judgment, it becomes difficult to say that the dogmatic philosopher is really even doing the same kind of activity as the skeptic philosopher. It seems as though they're antithetical, and this naturally raises the question, is it even possible to philosophize in such a way that one passes no judgments at all? So many of the great philosophers were animated by a desire to fend off skepticism. Kant, very famously, Hegel, the logical positivists, and yet it seems that in communicating anything at all, one has to, at least implicitly, affirm the value of communicating one's ideas, which is a judgment. Further complicating the matter, many philosophers have called themselves skeptics who ultimately are not. In the last episode, we explored Nietzsche's critique of Humean skepticism as a philosophy that, in Nietzsche's words, craves submission, or in Hume's words, places itself in subserviency to common sense and ends up affirming habit and custom. And so it's somewhat ironic that Hume's arguments make our moral and metaphysical beliefs dependent on custom, which we should affirm, and Socrates interrogates custom and habit. This may prompt us to ask another question: which doctrine ends up being more skeptical in practice? Is it Socrates, who in theory affirms doctrines, but in practice subjects everything to doubt? Is it Hume, who in theory subjects everything to doubt, but in practice affirms custom? Who's the real skeptic here? Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by skepticism, and as regards this issue, I would propose the following criterion for judgment. Perhaps it would be difficult to judge entire individuals. Maybe we can just resign ourselves to looking at moments or individual arguments. Whenever skepticism appears only as a tool or a means to an end in the service of a judgment, we can't call it skepticism in the ancient sense of the word. But whenever a philosopher withholds his judgment, in that instance, he is a skeptic, regardless of what he may call himself otherwise. This reframing is important because it returns us to the ancient notion that skepticism is a practice, an activity, a technique. We might also refer to it as a dynamis, a power. We could also call it an ability or a virtue that you possess. Whenever skepticism is extrapolated into a philosophical position, it's bound to appear self-contradictory, but we can make sense of skepticism if we maintain this understanding of it as a dynamis. So why would someone desire to have this ephektic power of the skeptics? To investigate this, it is necessary to return our focus to antiquity and attempt to understand the context and significance of the skeptic school. And there is no better figure to consider to center our analysis around than Pyrrho of Elis. He was born in 360 BC in the Greek world. His life bears witness to the profound transformations that would occur during that period. When he was a young man, Philip of Macedon crushed the armies of Athens and Thebes and brought Greece under his hegemonic control, effectively putting an end to the relative independence of the Greek city-states, which characterized the classical or Hellenic period. When Pyrrho was in his 30s, he and his teacher Anaxarchus accompanied Alexander on his march to Persia. They marched with him not as soldiers, but as philosophers. In terms of his intellectual lineage, Pyrrho's teacher Anaxarchus came from the school of Democritus. Democritus was a contemporary of Socrates. He presented a materialist theory of nature as comprised of atoms and void. He developed a theory of sense perception, and his agnosticism greatly influenced the Epicureans. Thus, many have drawn a link from Democritean philosophy to skepticism through Anaxarchus. The sources seem agreed that Pyrrho also learned from Stilpo, a philosopher from Megara of the Megarian school, who had put forward a rather skeptical argument that a noun can't even be justifiably connected with a predicate, attacking the basis of communicable knowledge. When it comes to the way of life that Pyrrho represents and the image of life that we receive in his biography, the virtues of Pyrrho, if we may call them that, closely resemble those of the ideal Greek sage. His life was exalted by the skeptics as an example of eudaimonia, good-spiritedness, the good life. The promise that the skeptical way of life brings tranquility, as we see in Pyrrho's philosophy and in the image of life of Pyrrho, that is certainly very similar to what was often articulated as the good of philosophy in the Greek world. But despite these similarities, it is doubtless that Pyrrho's ideas are a surprising departure from his predecessors in many ways. The fact that Pyrrho visited Persia and seems, according to many sources, to have spoken to Indian and Persian mystics has provided fertile ground for speculation about an Eastern influence to his philosophy. In Pyrrho's older years, there were still not many dull moments in history. He lived through the wars of Alexander's successors. By the time that he died in 270, the Greek world was now firmly in the Hellenistic period. Definitive lines between historical eras can always be scrutinized. It's always more complicated than we present it in the history books when we lay down the change from one era to another at a certain year or a certain century. But in the case of Pyrrho's life, we can simply say that this cultural shift happened over his lifetime, and that the Greek world he was born into was very different from the one that existed at the date of his death. Even if it's unclear exactly, we can't pin down exactly when the change happened, but you could say he was born into a different world than the one that he died in. Now, Diogenes Laertius, one of Nietzsche's favorite authors of the ancient world and chronicler of the lives of eminent philosophers, that's the title of his great work, he has this to say about the biography of Pyrrho. He writes that Pyrrho, quote, seems to have taken a noble line in philosophy, introducing the doctrine of incomprehensibility and of the necessity of suspending one's judgment, as we learn from Ascanius of Abdera. For he used to say that nothing was honorable, or disgraceful, or just, or unjust. And on the same principle, he asserted that there was no such thing as downright truth, but that men did everything in consequence of custom and law. For that nothing was any more this than that. And his life corresponded to his principles, for he never shunned anything, and never guarded against anything, encountering everything, even wagons, for instance, and precipices, and dogs, and everything of the sort, committing nothing whatever to his senses, so that he used to be saved, as Antigonus the Carystian tells us, by his friends who accompanied him. And Anicedemus says that he studied philosophy on the principle of suspending his judgment on all points, without, however, on any occasion acting in an imprudent manner, or doing anything without due consideration, and he lived to nearly 90 years of age. End quote. Further down, Laertius continues, writing that Pyrrho, quote, was originally a person of no reputation, but a poor man and a painter, and that a picture of some camp-bearers of very moderate execution was preserved in the gymnasium at Elis, which was his work, and that he used to walk out into the fields and seek solitary places, very rarely appearing to his family at home, and that he did this in consequence of having heard some Indian reproaching Anaxarchus for never teaching anyone else any good, but for devoting all his time to paying court to princes in palaces. He always maintained the same demeanor, so that if anyone left him in the middle of his delivery of a discourse, he remained and continued what he was saying. Although, when a young man, he was of a very excitable temperament, Often, too, says Antigonus, he would go away for a time without telling anyone beforehand, and taking any chance persons whom he chose for his companions. And once, when Anaxarchus had fallen into a pond, he passed by without assisting him. And when someone blamed him for this, Anaxarchus himself praised his indifference and absence of all emotion. End quote. There are so many comments I could make about this passage, but perhaps the first one has to be that it's very difficult to know exactly what about Pyrrho can be called a historical fact, and what could be sourced to hearsay or later tradition. There's almost always the issue with these ancient philosophers of extracting a historical nucleus out of the stories about Pyrrho. The first thing I would say about this is that Diogenes Laertius has long been known to be a fabulist, which in modern parlance means someone who makes things up sometimes. To his credit, he often compiles multiple sources, even when they conflict. Many of those sources are lost to us now, so we know them only through Laertius. But he seems above all concerned with relating the lives of these philosophers in the form of an exciting narrative. And so sometimes he bends the facts a little bit, so that the life of the philosopher he's writing about will parallel the philosophy. And basically all we know about Pyrrho is from secondary sources writing much later, such as Cicero, Laertius, and the later skeptic, perhaps the most important skeptic, Sextus Empiricus. Pyrrho left nothing written in his own hand. A.W. Benn, in his book The Greek Philosophers, more or less takes it for granted that the legendary indifference of Pyrrho was a kind of myth or exaggeration, writing, quote, "A contemporary of Alexander the Great, he accompanied the Macedonian army on its march to India. The absurd stories about his indifference to material obstacles when out walking are sufficiently refuted by the circumstances just related." End quote. In other words, a man doesn't survive a military march to Persia if he is truly indifferent to all obstacles or all events around him. It's so improbable that it's absurd at face value. But this is where I think the perspective of someone like Goethe on history is very useful, because when it comes to Pyrrho's significance, the philosophers influenced by Pyrrhonian skepticism throughout the ages, they didn't know the real Pyrrho. Right? They knew a Pyrrho who came down in stories and in these secondhand accounts. What is important is the image of life that Pyrrho came to represent. That is what had power. That in and of itself is a kind of historical fact. The myth of Pyrrho is what holds significance for so many philosophical minds, not the objective truth of his life, which we've never really known. And so, what is that image of life? It's an image of indifference. That is what Anaxarchus, his teacher, praised at the end of the section of Diogenes Laertius that we just considered. It seems as if he didn't care whether the person he encountered was an old friend or a total stranger. He would take them for a companion. He would speak to them the same in either case. He doesn't care whether somebody's standing in front of him to listen to his discourses or not. So he makes no distinction in these cases, and he takes no heed of the obstacles in front of him. He puts forward a philosophy in which nothing is any more this than it is that, nothing is just or unjust, nothing is true or false. And so we have the image of a man who, in all these anecdotes, makes no judgments. He always maintains the same demeanor. He's unflappable. He's unfazed by the circumstances around him. And so we get an image of life that discloses how the truly skeptical way of living might appear. It's not surprising that many would insist that such a way of life must only be a myth. It's simply too outlandish that a real person like Pyrrho could have lived. There are just a few more anecdotes from Diogenes Laertius beyond the ones already related that I do want to talk about. Pyrrho lived with his sister for a time. He would clean and do the household chores without any complaint, which for a Greek man at the time was, we might say, unusual. Quote, "And it is said that he carried his indifference so far that he even washed a pig." End quote. Once he was attacked by a dog, and he didn't manage to maintain his famous composure. And an onlooker made fun of him for this, and Pyrrho is said to have responded, quote, that it was a difficult thing entirely to put off humanity, but that a man ought to strive with all his power to counteract circumstances with his actions if possible, and at all events with his reason." End quote. So I'm only human. My reason ought to tell me that the best thing is to suspend judgment and therefore remain indifferent, but it's a hard thing to put off humanity. And once in a similar anecdote, his sister made him very angry, and somebody questioned him on this. "Oh, I thought you were supposed to be the indifferent philosopher." And he said something to the effect of that his indifference didn't apply when it comes to dealing with women. Again, he's only human, I guess. He has his flaws. But in spite of a few lapses in Pyrrho's famous passivity, one of the most famous stories connected with him was that he was so cultivated in his indifference that he could even maintain it during surgery. And keep in mind that in those days, there was no anesthesia. Quote, "When some cutting and cautery was applied to him for some wound, he never even contracted his brow." End quote. So he never even winced in pain. He didn't cringe. He didn't change his facial expression. I don't know about you, but being indifferent during surgery without anesthesia certainly seems like an accomplishment. But this is really what we're talking about when we describe the skeptical perspective as a kind of power, instead of an ideological commitment to not make judgments or something like that. This is what seems to have fascinated the Greek world when it came to Pyrrho. The eudaimonia that he represents, it takes the form of ataraxia. Ataraxia in modern language, although that's not a very widely used term either. Taraxia means being disturbed, stirred, moved, troubled in some way, and therefore ataraxia means not disturbed, not moved, not troubled. And so Pyrrho represents an image of the good life as impassivity, a state of being unmoved. Or we might say the power to prevent oneself from being emotionally moved or emotionally disturbed, the power to remain uninvested emotionally. And indeed, if we skip to the end of Laertius's entry on Pyrrho, he says, quote, "The skeptics say that the chief good is the suspension of judgment, which tranquility of mind follows like its shadow, as Timon and Anicedemus say." End quote. Timon and Anicedemus were Pyrrho's students, known as Pyrrhonians. Timon in particular was an important elaborator on Pyrrho. He's often cited by his biographers. Laertius concludes the chapter, quote, "Some authors have asserted that the chief good of the skeptics is impassibility. Others say that it is mildness and tranquility." End quote. How is it that impassivity, or we might say equanimity, how is it that that is the shadow of the suspension of judgment? Another term in Greek which is of great use here is adiaphora, indifference. Again, diaphora is difference, so a distinction between two things. Adiaphora is no difference. There is no distinction between these two things, whatever they may be. We might say that being in a state of adiaphora is to declare, at least in a given instance, whichever alternative happens, it is of no matter to me. And I think to get to the point being made here about ataraxia following as the shadow of adiaphora, whether or not you adopt a skeptical perspective in general, if you reflect in your personal life, you can probably think of many instances in which a decision was presented to you. You were asked to make a judgment on something, and in that particular instance, for whatever reason, you were just totally indifferent. Let's say you and your friends are trying to decide whether to meet up on Friday or Saturday, and you're free on both days, so it doesn't matter to you. And you say, the rest of you decide. You say, either day is fine, it doesn't matter to me. Now, when you reflect on judgments like that one, that are trivial, that are a matter of indifference, does any stress or disturbance or emotional turmoil follow from those judgments? No, not really. In any matter where you're genuinely indifferent, there is ataraxia. Any time when you can say, either way it doesn't matter, that suspension of judgment is at least accompanied with or correlated with a feeling of equanimity. Now, on the other hand, let's imagine a very different scenario. Let's imagine you're the president of a country and you're fighting a war, and you have to decide whether to sacrifice a few thousand soldiers as part of an offensive which will maybe give you a shot at winning the war. Or maybe the other alternative is don't do the counteroffensive, but risk letting the conflict go on for longer than it could have. And each day you continue to lose soldiers, but more slowly, and you prolong all of the privations and turmoil caused, by wartime in society at large. That decision will not be a matter of indifference to you, assuming that you're a good leader who cares about the people in your country, which we can't take for granted in reality, but let's take it for granted in this thought experiment. So, should you be indifferent in that second circumstance? Maybe such a thing isn't desirable. Maybe it's not even possible. But let's set aside prescriptive thinking and simply notice that the necessity of judgment is at least correlated with emotional turmoil. The more pressing the judgment, the more serious the emotional disturbance that accompanies it. The more indifferent one is towards a judgment, the less necessary you find it to make a judgment, the less emotional turmoil or disturbance. But this does, of course, bring us to the issue of practicability. And as Laertius already related in the first excerpt that I read, Pyrrho and his skeptical school held that men do everything in accord with custom and law. According to Laertius, the skeptics argued, quote, "As to those things which do not depend on us, but upon necessity, such as hunger, thirst, and pain, those we cannot avoid, for it is not possible to put an end to them by reason." End quote. Further down, Laertius continues, quote, "When the dogmatic philosophers object that the skeptic, on his principles, will not refuse to kill his own father if he is ordered to do so that they answer that they can live very well without disquieting themselves about the speculations of the dogmatic philosophers, but suspending their judgment in all matters which do not refer to living and the preservation of life. Accordingly, say they, we avoid some things and we seek others, following custom in that, and we obey the laws." End quote. Some words come to mind in comparison to this description of the dogmatic interacting with the skeptical philosophers. The words that come to mind, ironically, are from a Stoic, Marcus Aurelius, because the skeptics and Stoics were sort of competing schools. And yet Aurelius in his Meditations sounds a similar note when he says, quote, "You don't have to form an opinion about this and trouble your mind. Things themselves have no inherent power to form our opinions." End quote. So when the dogmatic philosopher, the philosopher who teaches a doctrine, raises the example of being asked to kill one's own father, the skeptic answers first, well, this is simply a hypothetical. It's a rhetorical argument. In reality, I don't have to make a judgment about this. I don't have to decide what to do in some hypothetical scenario. I only have to make judgments in regard to practical necessities which I can't avoid. Why would I disquiet myself, disturb myself, break my ataraxia for the sake of entertaining your hypotheticals? But if you must know, in practical terms, we follow custom, we obey laws, we deal with the practical necessities of life, and we avoid some things and seek after other things. Now, there are all sorts of contradictions and paradoxes that should be dancing around in your mind by this point in the talk. Because for one, this kind of apologia for skepticism is very different from the totally indifferent picture of Pyrrho's life given at the beginning of the chapter. And I don't think this is the fault of Diogenes Laertius making a mistake in interpretation. It seems very likely to me that the arguments of the skeptics, once they've formed into a school of thought, have to conform to practical realities, whereas the image of life we receive in this sort of the mythic picture of Pyrrho as totally indifferent doesn't seem to conform to practical realities. So they kind of want to have it both ways, but it's unclear if Pyrrho himself was even trying to found a school, and that's an important point. It would seem incommensurate with his philosophy if it were his point to preach his own way of life as a guide for the lives of others. The example in the first excerpt of Pyrrho walking past Anacharchus, his friend and mentor, while Anacharchus is struggling in a pond, right? Perhaps he might drown. That's the clearest example of this sort of contradictory way that skepticism is presented, as both being in sort of willing to capitulate to practical necessity, and then Pyrrho's image of life where it seems as if he ignores these things. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the drowning child thought experiment of Peter Singer, the main thinker of effective altruism. Singer would argue that if we assume a utilitarian view based on maximizing the greatest good for the greatest many, we can't regard distant moral evils, such as a starving child in a foreign country, as any different than we would regard a drowning child right in front of us. The distance cannot be of any consideration, nor even our genetic relation to the child, if we adopt a utilitarian moral perspective. The reason I bring this up is that the Anaxarchus drowning in a pond anecdote shows that Pyrrho probably wouldn't even save the drowning child, not to speak of burdening himself with moral evils happening far away and beyond his immediate control. It's actually rather hard to say that Pyrrho's way of life, when extrapolated into a doctrine, can make a compelling argument against killing your own father if you're ordered to do so. But once again, this is why I wanted to begin this episode by sort of delineating the territory of what skepticism really is. And I would hold that the confusion here comes from the fact that Pyrrhonism was elaborated into a school of thought, and that skepticism will always be confusing when it takes this form. And Laertius records that even by his own time, there were commenters who had made similar critiques. Quote, Theodosius, in his chapters on skepticism, contends that we ought not to call the Peronian school skeptical. For since, says he, the motion and agitation of the mind in each individual is incomprehensible to others, we are unable to know what was the disposition of Pyrrho. And if we do not know it, we ought not to be called Pyrrhonians. He also adds that Pyrrho was not the original inventor of skepticism, and that he had no particular dogma of any kind, and that consequently it can only be called Pyrrhonism from some similarity. End quote. So we only get a Pyrrhonist, or a Pyrrhonian school, if we can say there is a similarity of dogma between the skeptics influenced by Pyrrho and Pyrrho himself. But Pyrrho didn't teach any particular dogmas. And I love the Theodosian critique here because it's skeptical. He says, what do we know of the inner state of mind of Pyrrho? What do we know of his true disposition? We know nothing. All we have is speculation. We only know how Pyrrho appeared in the world. And Theodosius also raises this issue of skepticism not being original to Pyrrho, which we will get to in a moment, because you can find skeptical positions throughout the Greek culture. What I would say to Theodosius is that in the appearance of Pyrrho, in the image of life we have of him, we do have a sign or a signifier for the dynamis, the power of suspending judgment, which is not something Pyrrho invented, but something that he most effectively represents. But then this brings us to the issue of whether or not it is sensible to found a philosophical school aimed at attaining the ataraxia of Pyrrho, or at least the ataraxia he appeared to have. Again, we have to ask, is it not a judgment to say that ataraxia follows as the shadow of adiaphora? Are you not making a judgment? One thing necessarily follows after the other. One thing causes the other. Sextus Empiricus has a rather interesting argument regarding this question. Is the skeptical perspective a criterion for attaining the practical moral end of ataraxia? Because if that is what it is, we would affirm Pyrrho's project as valuable because it leads us to a state of indifference. So the skepticism isn't really the point. You have this other sort of moral aim that skepticism is trying to attain. Sextus tries to maneuver out of this problem. And I really like the way A.W. Benn puts this. I've quoted from his work because I really like his chapters on Pyrrho and Pyrrhonic skepticism, even though I don't like Benn's overall philosophical worldview. I think he does a good job of it. But he writes, quote, we find Pyrrho competing with the dogmatists as a practical moralist and offering to secure the inward tranquility at which they too aimed by an easier method than theirs. The last eminent representative of the skeptical school, Sextus Empiricus, illustrates its pretensions in this respect by the well-known story of Apelles, who, after vainly endeavoring to paint the foam on a horse's mouth, took the sponge which he used to wipe his easel and threw it at the picture in vexation. The mixture of colors thus accidentally applied produced the exact effect which he desired, but at which no calculation could arrive. In like manner, says Sextus, the confusion of universal doubt accidentally resulted in the imperturbability which accompanies suspense of judgment, as surely as a body is followed by its shadow. End quote. This story of Apelles is fascinating as a justification because, as Benn puts it, it serves as an analogy for, we might say, a good which is achieved but without calculation. Within the throes of confusion, one reaches the place they wished to arrive at. This suspension of judgment is something that occurs insensibly when you're in a state in which you genuinely cannot decide, in which each alternative seems to be equally good or perhaps equally bad, and so out of frustration you snap, you throw it all away, you throw away the right of judgment, and then, as an accident, the tranquility appears. And so in the narrative of Sextus Empiricus, one reaches a state of universal doubt, doubt towards everything, suspension of all judgment, and finds, quite by mistake, that this is the best state of the spirit. And perhaps then there's no surefire method for arriving at this state of mind. It simply happens, and I cannot help but think of the Zen stories of spontaneous realizations, for which there is no method, no instruction manual. Perhaps that's one of the reasons for the speculation about a potential Eastern influence on Pyrrho. But nevertheless, as I mentioned before, there are numerous instances of adiaphora in Greek literature, and it is for this reason that I think this Eastern hypothesis is not really necessary. Pyrrho was fond of quoting past figures who had mused along similar lines. He would repeat the saying of Democritus, quote, "But we know nothing really, for truth is in the depths," end quote. As Laertius points out, Democritus had called into question the validity of the way the world appears, with his whole theory of sense perception. His assertion that the truth of matter is that it is atoms and void. That's what the material world really is. Atoms and void are certainly not what we see, though, in the appearance of the world. When we experience sense perceptions like cold and warmth or pleasure and pain, Democritus says these are not absolutes, these are relative perceptions. What is cold in opinion. What is hot in opinion. Laertius gives, after this, a rather robust series of quotations from preceding figures that all express a skeptical attitude. And I just want to read through these because I think it is important to establish this possibility that skepticism, when we look at it not as a school but as a practice, is in fact a long-standing aspect, a long-standing tradition of the Greek culture. And so I'm going to read from Diogenes Laertius here, but he's going to quote from many Greek figures. Quote, "Plato, too, attributes the knowledge of the truth to the gods and to the sons of the gods, and leaves men only with the investigation of probability. And Euripides says, 'Who now can tell whether to live may not be properly to die, and whether that which men do call to die may not in truth be but the entrance into real life?' And Empedocles speaks thus, 'These things are not perceptible to sight, nor to the ears, nor comprehensible to human intellect.' And in a preceding passage he says, 'Believing nothing but such circumstances as have befallen each.' Heraclitus, too, says, 'Let us not form conjectures at random about things of the greatest importance.' And Hippocrates delivers his opinion in a very doubtful manner, such as becomes a man, and before them all, Homer has said, 'Long in the field of words we may contend. Reproach is infinite and knows no end.' And immediately after, 'Armed with truth or falsehood, right or wrong, so voluble a weapon is the tongue. Wounded we wound, and neither side can fail, for every man has equal strength to rail.'" End quote. So that's Heraclitus, Plato, Hippocrates, Empedocles, Euripides, and finally Homer. You will find many divergent opinions, many divergent lives in such company, but it seems that all of them at different times expressed the value of suspending judgment. And the cluster of quotes ends with Homer, whose point in the passage we just read is to point out that these disputations between differing perspectives can go on forever. Armed with truth or falsehood, right or wrong. So armed with our differing judgments or criterions of distinction, and with the weapons of the tongue, with our rhetoric, we can argue indefinitely. No side in the dispute will fail due to the words of the opposing side. Dialogue, in fact, does not give us the power to vanquish our ideological enemies. That is a misunderstanding of the real power of speech. And Laertius draws attention to the fact that Greek philosophy occupies itself primarily with this distinction between truth and appearance, and that in and of itself opens the way to a form of skepticism. Whether or not these philosophers are themselves skeptics, this notion that the world as it appears isn't really the way it is, that fosters a doubt. It fosters a suspension of judgment about things. So even if Plato's entire goal is to produce this criterion of judgment for determining what is true and false, and ultimately Socrates makes the argument that we have to wrest truth in what stands firm beyond the changeable world of appearances that seduce the common people and the lovers of sights and sounds. So he is seeking a criterion of judgment. Nevertheless, that very criterion of judgment breaks open into this sort of doubt and suspension of judgment about the world as it appears. And perhaps that wasn't even Socrates' or Plato's intention, but that is nevertheless one of these cultural threads that leads into the later skepticism of Pyrrho and Empiricus. And I want to say a few more words about one of the figures that's only mentioned in passing, who's not a philosopher. He mentions Hippocrates. The connection of early skeptics to the school of medicine is of great importance. Sextus Empiricus, as we may gather from his name, was a physician of the empiric school of medicine. Empiricism has a medical meaning before it has a philosophical meaning. The empirics believed you should follow what is apparent and evident in your diagnosis of an illness, and you should base that diagnosis on past medical precedent. There were competing schools against the empirics. There was the dogmatic school of medicine, which believed in searching for hidden causes of illnesses based on a theoretical understanding of the physiology. And there was also the methodic school, which involved dealing with the symptoms in a methodical way. So rather than basing your diagnosis on past precedents or on some theoretical understanding of the body, you say, okay, we have this symptom, we apply this method, and you just simply follow that method. Empiricism in medicine is therefore an evidence-based approach, and it considered the evidence of past experience. In a sense, we can understand the term at face value in its modern meaning, just simply applied to medicine. Now, there is some debate as to whether the empiric school of medicine is actually the school that most closely aligns with the attitudes of the philosophical skeptics. Mary Mills Patrick, in her book on Sextus Empiricus, points out that even though Sextus Empiricus himself seems, as a matter of fact, to have practiced empiric medicine, and, quote, the later Pyrrhonians, when they were physicians, as was often the case, belonged for the most part to this school, end quote, nevertheless, Sextus made some comments at one point that the methodical school was actually the closest to the spirit of philosophical skepticism. Now, this controversy isn't particularly important for our purposes. It's an interesting historical or philological question, I guess, but none of these differing schools of medicine exist anymore, or rather, the debate doesn't exist anymore. What is important, in my opinion, are the following facts. Perhaps the most important skeptic was a physician, Sextus Empiricus. Diogenes Laertius quotes here from Hippocrates, speaking about the importance of skepticism when practicing medicine. And this shows that there is a practical application to skepticism, a practical application to withholding judgment, but only when that suspension of judgment is coupled with a willingness to yield to what is evident. And I think this accounts for many of the complications involved whenever empiricism and skepticism are seen as intertwined, because the idea that you should yield to what is evident is a criterion of judgment, which means the skeptic, the philosophical skeptic, can't absolutely affirm it. And thus, when Sextus judges which of the medical schools is most skeptical in spirit, it's the methodic school, because it simply deals with what is immediately obvious, the symptoms, while making no further judgment at all. But is that the best way to practice medicine? When Sextus himself practices medicine, it seems from all accounts he is an empiric, and is willing to make a judgment about what the illness is based on past evidence and precedent. And in a little bit, we'll get more deeply into this question of philosophical skepticism and philosophical empiricism and their relation. Here we're just sort of talking about the medical schools of thought relating to the philosophical schools. But I think that's important because it shows that, for one, skepticism, withholding judgment, very obviously, indisputably, it is a power in many domains of human activity. Withholding your judgment as a doctor would seem to be very important. You shouldn't just give the first diagnosis that comes to mind or the first thing that seems like readily apparent. You should probably dig deeper and try to establish for certain what is afflicting the patient. But it would seem for a more sort of complete approach to medicine, you do also have to make judgments, and it seems that Sextus Empiricus was willing to make his judgments based on the evidence when it came to medicine, based on past precedents. So that tells us something very interesting, too, again, about this sort of the negotiations with practical life that the skeptic has to make. Now, when it comes to the philosophical forerunners to the school of skeptics, A.W. Benn sees the forerunner in Gorgias, who was one of the sophists. In particular, the argument that Gorgias reportedly gives in On Non-Existence, in which Gorgias argues that there are no existent things, and if there were existent things, we would not be able to apprehend them with the mind, and even if we could apprehend them with the power of the mind, we would not be able to communicate those apprehensions to others. So nothing exists. If it did, we can't know it, and if we could know it, we couldn't communicate it. Gorgias's essay did not survive out of antiquity, and Sextus Empiricus's presentation of the arguments is one of the main sources through which we know the written work of Gorgias, through second-hand sources. Certainly the argument that nothing actually exists would contradict our experience with the world as it appears. But the obvious skeptical objection to including Gorgias as a prefiguration of skepticism would be the claim that nothing exists is just as much of an explicit, affirmative judgment about reality as even the naive realist position. But this is why the overall attitude and outlook of the sophists is very important to understand, and to contextualize the positions taken by Gorgias and on non-existence is very important. Gorgias was known as a satirist. Sometimes he would take positions for the sake of humor, for the sake of playing devil's advocate. Many have interpreted his arguments in On Non-Existence as a direct counter to the positions of Parmenides. Parmenides says only being exists, in other words, only what exists exists. Non-existent things can't exist by definition. Therefore, there's no such thing as nothingness. Therefore, there's no such thing as motion or change or empty space. If we say that what exists could change, then we'd have to adopt the position that existent things can pass into non-existence and vice versa. But that relies on this conception of non-existence, which is fundamentally impossible for Parmenides. Reality, as it actually is pure being. That is the school of the Eleatics. That's their position. This suspicion that motion is an illusion is yet another idea that Laertius treats as a potential Greek precursor to the skepticism of Pyrrho. In other words, it's another example that of philosophers telling us that the world really is not the way it appears to be. The hallmark of the sophists was the counterposing of perspectives in order to show that two antithetical positions could both be argued and convincingly justified. Protagoras is another key figure among the sophists who is said to have argued that there were two sides to every issue, both of which could be defended, and he is said to have argued that everything is true. This has led many to suspect that Gorgias, a sophist like Protagoras, was attempting to show that the opposite position of Parmenides' theory of pure being could also be convincingly argued, a theory of pure nothingness, pure non-existence. If we accept this framing for the sake of argument that that's what Gorgias is doing, then his aims in presenting his argument for the non-existence of all things is not actually a doctrine or a final position. It's a performative act of philosophy, which places the Parmenidean theory of being on equal footing with a Gorgian theory of non-being. Now, why do the sophists operate this way? There are many interpretations of the sophistic style of philosophy. We've talked about this many times in the podcast, but Plato portrayed the sophists as teachers of rhetoric for whom the truth was only of secondary importance, and he criticized them on this basis. They don't care about truth. Friedrich Nietzsche would take up for the side of the sophists. He portrayed the Greek culture as, quote, the culture of the sophists. It was a culture defined by agonistic competition, with the sophists bringing that competition into the realm of dialectic. all seem to agree that the sophists attributed more power and more importance to persuasion than anyone had before, and certainly more importance than to seeking the truth. As Nietzsche puts it, the sophists and all the ancient rhetors and orators made the most immoderate proclamations of their power to do almost anything, because they knew that words determined the way people feel about things, the way they experience things, their opinions about things, and therefore they might as well have control over reality itself, because we only know reality through our experience of it, our interpretation of it, our opinion of it. They control our opinion about reality. They might as well control reality itself. Nietzsche's quite correct that that's a very immoderate presumption, that they have this kind of power. But the aspect of the sophists that is of the greatest importance to us in considering their influence on Pyrrho and on skepticism generally is in the fact that the sophists seem comfortable to maintain an attitude of adiaphora regarding the truth or the correctness of a position. For them, the important power, the all-powerful ability, the greatest dynamis is the power to persuade. In order to demonstrate this, they show how two opposing positions can be argued persuasively. But two antithetical positions, logically speaking, can't both be right, and therefore in the sophistic demonstration of the counterposing of two equally plausible but antithetical judgments, we reach a state of adiaphora. Perhaps this was to show the power of rhetoric above the truth, but perhaps we might say that, if Sextus Empiricus is correct about the effect of ataraxia following accidentally from this state, we might imagine a sophist philosopher who, like Apelles, finds himself unexpectedly in a tranquil state of mind. Perhaps the sophist would then recite those words of Homer to himself, that the contests of the tongue can last indefinitely, and in perceiving this, he is able to release himself from his care about which position is correct, knowing that mankind knows only appearances and never the absolute truth. The truth remains in the depths. And if we keep this in mind as we consider how Diogenes Laertius describes the methods of the skeptics, we'll find that this is exactly how they proceed, by this sophist counterposing of antithetical positions. Quote, "The skeptics persevered in overthrowing all the dogmas of every sect, while they themselves asserted nothing dogmatically, and contented themselves with expressing the opinions of others, without affirming anything themselves, not even that they did affirm nothing, so that they even discarded all positive denial, for to say we affirm nothing was to affirm something. But we, said they, enunciate the doctrines of others, to prove our own perfect indifference. It is just as if we were to express the same thing by a simple sign. So these words, we affirm nothing, indicate the absence of all affirmation. Just as other propositions, such as, not more one thing than another, or every reason has a corresponding reason opposed to it, and all such maxims indicate a similar idea." End quote. Further down, he continues, quote, "The Pyrrhonian system, then, is a simple explanation of appearances, or of notions of every kind, by means of which, comparing one thing with another, arrives at the conclusion that there is nothing in all these notions but contradiction and confusion. As Anicedemus says in his introduction to Pyrrhonism, as to the contradictions which are found in those speculations, when they have pointed out in what way each fact is convincing, they then by the same means take away all belief from it. For they say that we regard as certain those things which always produce similar impressions on the senses, those which are the offspring of habit, or which are established by the laws, and those too which give pleasure or excite wonder. And they prove that the reasons opposite to those in which our assent is founded are entitled to equal belief." End quote. It's interesting that Laertius calls this a system. That might be going a bit far, but I think it's fair to call it a method. It's a method of always bringing forth the counter-argument to every position with equal force and persuasion, and by showing how each mutually exclusive position can be made to appear equally convincing, they take away all belief in these positions. Where does that leave the skeptical philosopher then? He's not in a position of affirming nothing, affirming no judgment, but rather of affirming two contradictory positions at the same time, and thus, as regards the truth or falsehood of these two positions, revealing that it's a matter of indifference. It's not adiaphora. There's no meaningful distinction you can make between these two perspectives, as regards their truth anyway. All you can do is suspend judgment, and that means tranquility will follow. Or at least that's the skeptical claim. And I'm sure one could, and in fact should, if they're a good skeptic, they should argue for the counter proposition with equal force. And that brings us back to the empirical bent, to the skeptical school, which Laertius says goes back to Pyrrho. Quote, Timon, in his Python, says that Pyrrho does not destroy the authority of custom, and in his images he speaks thus, but what is evidently seen prevails, wherever it may be. And in his treatise on the senses he says, the reason why a thing is sweet I do not declare, but I confess that the fact of sweetness is evident. So too Anicedemus, in the first book of his Peronian discourses, says that Pyrrho defines nothing dogmatically on account of the possibility of contradiction, but that he is guided by what is evident. End quote. And this brings us back to the link with empiricism. So the only real way that you will know if the skeptical claims about tranquility following from suspension of judgment will be if that tranquility is evident to you in your own experience, wherever judgment is withheld. Further, notice that we have heard many times thus far that Pyrrhonism does not go against custom. And in the previous excerpt, Laertius even says that the skeptics regard as certain those things that produce similar impressions on the senses, which are the offspring of habit. It is almost impossible not to bring up David Hume in reaction to this, especially because Hume counterposed his own position in Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding with the position of those he called Pyrrhonian skeptics. And yet the positions of Pyrrho and his school seem remarkably similar to Hume, even when it comes to the issue of going along with habit or custom, when it comes to practical matters. And further, not to deny what is evident in our immediate sense impressions. It's all completely commensurate with Hume's position, and it seems therefore to be something of a mystery why Hume would define his moderate or academical skeptical position as opposed to the position of Pyrrho. The only explanation I can give is that Hume is essentially doing what many philosophers have done. He's bashing an extreme form of skepticism that makes moral philosophy, here meaning practical philosophy, it makes it impossible because it would render us unable to make judgments, and Hume wants to be able to make judgments. He wants to establish a criterion of judgment. In fact, that's how he concludes his inquiry, by giving a criterion for determining what is real philosophy and what is sophistry and illusion. And so Hume chooses to signify this extreme form of skepticism with the name of Pyrrho. But is this fair? Is it possible that he does this because of the image of Pyrrho's life? Because again, we're told these stories about how Pyrrho was so indifferent even in how he dealt with day-to-day affairs and obstacles, and he wouldn't even save his drowning friend, and so on. And it seems as though if such an indifference were adopted, it would be impracticable. But just based on what is in Diogenes Laertius, Hume's caricature of Pyrrho would seem to be unjustified. Hume raises the possibility that a Pyrrhonian skepticism would become doubtful even of the senses, but Pyrrho is guided by what is evident. He doesn't doubt the senses in that same way. Hume says that these abstruse philosophers will produce impractical philosophies that will defy custom and good sense, and they'll vanish when the philosopher leaves the shade. But Pyrrho, at least according to some accounts, affirms custom and good sense, just like Hume does. And perhaps the fact that he was said to have lived to be 90 years old, and that he never acted imprudently, speaks to the possibility that he wasn't, in practice, as totally indifferent as some of the stories might have us believe. Now, what is the actual philosophical content here? What do the skeptics have to say if they're not going to affirm any positions? And as regards the philosophical content of Pyrrho, what we mainly have are the tropes of skeptical disputation that are attributed to him. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term tropes. We use the term tropes today, mainly in the arts. We refer to it as a sort of a recurring theme, a familiar structure The term comes from tropos. It means a turn, a direction, or a course. If you know how Odysseus is described at the beginning of the Odyssey, he's called polytropos, a word that's notoriously difficult to translate into English. Literally, he's the many-turned Odysseus. He's a man of many ways. He's ingenious and crafty. He's not above using lies or trickery. He's complicated. He has as many good qualities as bad qualities. He has many talents. He adapts to the situation. And quite literally, his journey, his wanderings, turn him in many directions. His fate is to ride the ups and downs of the wheel of fortune. Now, the original use of the term trope, literally a turning, comes from an application in language. The same way we would say in modern parlance, a turn of phrase, a figure of speech. And the term came to be used in rhetoric for a recurring theme, a repeated form or style of expression. So in the rhetorical sense, a trope becomes a style of disputation. So basically, the philosophical content of Pyrrhonian skepticism is actually just these 10 different turns of phrase, these 10 different turnings of language. Diogenes Laertius relates all of these tropes, and some other commenters like Sextus Empiricus, they present the same tropes, but they put them in a different order. I'm just going to present them in the order that Laertius does. So these are the familiar or recurring themes of how Pyrrho liked to argue. And so I suppose this can serve as a kind of guide to the prospective skeptic for the kinds of arguments to deploy against naive realists or Platonists or whoever you're arguing against. The first trope, what is sensed as pleasant or unpleasant, differs according to what kind of animal senses it. It's a point that we can find in Heraclitus, right? The donkey prefers straw to gold. And as we know with human beings, it's the other way around. Or cows enjoy eating grass, whereas if you as a human being were to go out into a field and graze, you would not find that the grass whets your appetite in the same way. It wouldn't properly nourish you. You wouldn't even like the taste. But that tells us something, doesn't it? That the cow is having a different sense experience than we have access to. The grass, on the level of the way it is experienced, the taste of it on the way it's experienced, is something different for the cow. Quote, young branches are eagerly eaten by the goat, but are bitter to mankind. And hemlock is nutritious for the quail, but deadly to man. And pigs eat their own dung, but a horse does not. End quote. So by tying this to pleasure and displeasure, the matter is made explicitly clear. The types of sensations that create pleasure can't be said to produce pleasure in and of themselves. They only contain a quality which is experienced as pleasure by certain types of life. Other types of life might experience the same conditions as painful. And so therefore our arguments about what constitutes the good or the valuable or the beautiful can't ever be absolute. They can't ever be taken without consideration for the type of beings that we are. We have to incorporate the sense that we have for phenomena and the value that we attribute to phenomena before we can make a determination. So we have to incorporate perspective. Even if all mankind shared the same sense for something, attributed the same value to something, it still doesn't become absolute. It would just represent the human perspective. Quote, from this we conclude that the same objects do not always produce the same impressions, and that the fact of this difference ought to be a reason with us for suspending our judgment. End quote. Second, what is sensed as pleasant or unpleasant differs even between human beings. And this much seems obvious as well. While you can certainly abstract an idea such as, the worst possible suffering for everyone and agree that all mankind would be united in avoiding such an abstraction, what is constituted by suffering differs from person to person. Just as you can put two different animals in the same circumstances, with the same sense impressions, and it can be wonderful for one and fatal for another, the conditions in which the Greenland shark lives versus, any animal that dwells on land, right, would be quite fatal for you to go down to the bottom of the ocean and try to live there in the same conditions. But the same thing applies to human beings. You can put a really introverted person who is most at home in the outdoors in an office job, and they'll be miserable. You can put a really social person in that same position, or a person who's very aggressive, enjoys fulfilling their ambitions through the world of business. They might love that situation. So again, there's not some objective quality in the sense impressions. It's how they're experienced. Quote, "One man is fond of medicine, another of farming, another of commerce, and the same pursuits are good for one man and injurious to another, on which account we ought to suspend our opinions." End quote. Third, different types of sensations produce unrelated sense experiences, which can't be derived from one another. So we have different organs, they give us different types of representations in different forms: auditory, visual, olfactory, gustatory, tactile. This is what Hume called avenues of sensation. In fact, the best way of articulating this argument might be to use Hume's argument when he says that Adam, this hypothetical first person with their rational faculties intact but no experience of the world, they wouldn't be able to tell from the light that the fire gives that it would consume them. Maybe Adam sees the light from a fire far away and he's never encountered fire, so he doesn't know from seeing the light of it that it would give off heat. How would he infer from the visual sense impression an associated tactile sense impression? Quote, "An apple presents itself to the sight as yellow, to the taste as sweet, to the smell as fragrant, and the same form is seen in very different lights according to the differences of mirrors." End quote. So the analogy is that our sense organs are mirroring the world for us, but all with different types of signifiers. Could you infer from the appearance of the apple that it would taste sweet? You can also think of Hume's example of inferring the fact that an object has the likeness of bread, that it will therefore nourish you like bread. But you're inferring something about the inner content, about the secret powers of the bread from the visual appearance. But you don't actually have a certain rational ground to stand on in making that inference. I could make something that appears a lot like a loaf of French bread out of styrofoam or paper mache, and it wouldn't nourish you even if it appeared that way at first glance. The section concludes, quote, "It follows, therefore, that what is seen is just as likely to be something else as the reality." End quote. Fourth, what is sensed as pleasant or unpleasant differs even within the same human being, according to the disposition of the moment. And we've all had this experience. I use an example from my life. I play in a band. I love going to see live music. But at the end of a 3-week or a month-long tour, sometimes you are just sick of being out at venues full of people and seeing live music every single night and having to socialize and watch 3 other bands play. And it can almost become like a chore. But it's the same experience that I crave when I've been at home for a month or so. So the experience itself, the set of sense impressions associated with the experience, can be felt very differently even by the same human being at different times, depending on your mood, depending on what happened to you earlier that day, or whether you got into a fight with your girlfriend, or if you're tired or hungry. And Laertius lists out many possible factors in his explanation of this trope. Quote, "Health, sickness, sleep, waking, joy, grief, youth, old age, courage, fear, want, abundance, hatred, friendship, warmth, cold, easiness of breathing, oppression of the respiratory organs, and so on. The objects therefore appear different to us according to the disposition of the moment. For even madmen are not in a state contrary to nature. For why are we to say that of them more than of ourselves? For we too look at the sun as if it stood still. Theon of Tithora the Stoic used to walk about in his sleep, and a slave of Pericles used in the same state to walk on the top of the house." End quote. And I love that line, that we too look at the sun as if it stood still. We know that the sun does not stand still. Even experience tells us that. But and yet it appears to, right? Its movement is so slow as it tracks across the sky that at a given moment when you look up at it, it's not as if the sun is darting around every which direction. But again, it's just that it's developing this doubtfulness, this suspension of judgment about the way things appear, and showing that we even know from personal experience how things appear very differently to us than they actually are. Fifth, the fundamental values that we hold regarding morality, justice, or the sacred differ between cultures. And this is a pretty standard cultural relativist argument. This type of argument is not uncommon in our own times, but we should pick up on this theme that it's not some quality inherent to quote-unquote objects out there that gives us pleasure or displeasure, just as it's not some quality inherent to certain behaviors or ways of life that causes us to call them good or bad, or moral or immoral, or sacred or profane. Quote, on this principle, we can see that the Persians do not think it unnatural for a man to marry his daughter, but among the Greeks it is unlawful. Again, the Masagetae, as Eudoxus tells us in the first book of his travels over the world, have their women in common, but the Greeks do not. And the Sicilians delight in piracy, but the Greeks avoid it. So again, different nations worship different gods, and some believe in the providence of God and others do not. The Egyptians embalm their dead and then bury them, the Romans burn them, and the Paeonians throw them into the lakes. All these considerations show that we ought to suspend our judgment. End quote. And there may be, quite obviously, there's some stereotyping going on here, right? Especially the first thing that I find it very hard to believe that the Persians would make a practice of people marrying their daughters. Seems very unlikely to me. But, the broader point holds true, even if the specific examples are not familiar to us. Like, as regards marriage, even in the modern world, between many of our cultures, people have very different views cross-culturally about what, marriage is, about ideas about love and relationships, or indeed whether marriage even should have anything to do with love, whether it is that kind of romantic relationship, or perhaps your family should arrange a marriage, something like that. And the different religious convictions about whether or not you should bury or burn your dead. These are very real differences even to this very day. The sixth trope is to argue that because we sense things differently according to the other things sensed, we don't know the quote-unquote true sense of something. And as an example, a color appears differently in light than in shade. And which is the true expression of that color? Are you seeing the true color when you see a shade of purple in sunlight, or when you see it in lamplight? Well, both purples are just epiphenomena. Who's to say what the proper set of other impressions is that you have to have in order to subjectively experience purple as it really is? Yeah, for example, do you remember that picture of a dress that went viral and that everyone argued over, whether it was white and gold or black and blue? And, that's not to say there's not, sure people say, well, it was objectively black and blue, right? But that misses the point. The very fact that in certain lighting, so many people could be mistaken about such a wildly different color combination, I think makes the point rather powerfully. Quote, nothing is seen by us simply and by itself, but in combination either with air or with light, or with moisture, or with solidity, or heat, or cold, or motion, or evaporation, or some other power. Accordingly, purple exhibits a different hue in the sun, and in the moon, and in a lamp, and our own complexions appear different when seen at noonday and at sunset. End quote. Number 7, the sense of things differs depending on our place and position. And this quite literally refers to perspectivism, or perspective in a spatial sense. And this doesn't just refer to the apparent size of objects. There are quite a few other elements to this. Quote, objects which we believe to be large sometimes appear small. Those which we believe to be square sometimes appear round. Those which we fancy even appear full of projections. Those which we think straight seem bent, and those which we believe to be colorless appear of quite a different complexion. Accordingly, the sun, on account of its distance from us, appears small. The mountains to at a distance appear airy masses and smooth, but when beheld close, they are rough. Again, the sun has one appearance at his rise and quite a different one at midday, and the same body looks very different in a wood from what it does on plain ground. So too the appearance of an object changes according to its position as regards us. For instance, the neck of a dove varies as it turns. Since then it is impossible to view these things irrespectively of place and position, it is clear that their real nature is not known. End quote. So there is no absolute seeing. There is no canonical setting and placement and position relative to other things in which to view something. And the backdrop against which we place an object can greatly affect how we perceive it. And so when it comes to the objects in the world, their real nature is not known because we never achieve a view from nowhere. All vantages are relative. Eighth, the magnitude or the quantity of a phenomenon can affect how it is experienced. So just by increasing the quantity of something, you can produce a different sense. Quote, for instance, a moderate quantity of wine, when taken, invigorates, but an excessive quantity weakens, and the same is the case with food and other similar things, end quote. And this is true with all drugs, pretty much anything you ingest. A little bit can often be healthy, whereas beyond a certain point it becomes unhealthy. Ninth, the sense that we have for something depends on whether it is experienced frequently or rarely. And I'm reminded of an anecdote that apparently the prisoners in the state of Maine at one point protested because they were tired of being fed lobster for every meal. Lobster is usually considered a nice meal, but up in Maine, they had a bunch of surplus lobster. They would just give it to the prisoners all the time, and eventually you get sick of it. So part of this may involve that by repeating the experiences with a certain sensation, it can go from pleasurable to displeasurable. In the text, we find another potential example, quote, earthquakes excite no wonder among those nations with whom they are of frequent occurrence, nor does the sun, because he is seen every day, end quote. So repeated experiences become familiar. They no longer cause surprise or disturbance. If you move somewhere where they have earthquakes all the time, like somewhere in California, and you experience your first earthquake as somebody, from the Midwest, it will probably be stressful. Maybe it's even exciting as a first experience. But the people who experience it all the time come to expect it, and the event has a different sense for them. 10th, and finally, all relative qualities we give to things are unintelligible without their relation to other things. Quote, the 10th mode refers to the comparison between one thing and another, as, for instance, between what is light and what is heavy, between what is strong and what is weak, between what is greater and what is less, what is above and what is below. For instance, that which is on the right is not on the right intrinsically and by nature, but it is looked upon as such in consequence of its relation to something else. And if that other thing be transposed, then it will no longer be on the right. In the same way, a man is spoken of as father or brother or relation to someone else, and day is called so in relation to the sun, and everything has its distinctive name in relation to human thought. Therefore, those things which are known in relation to others are unknown of themselves. End quote. And this is a point made by, among others, Lao Tzu. We could say Heraclitus once again. But in the Tao Te Ching, there's a passage where this comes through very strongly. It's very explicit about this. I believe it's chapter 2, that back depends on front, first depends on last, left depends on right, good depends on bad, beauty depends on ugliness, and so on. All of these qualifiers or descriptors, these means we have of describing the objects of the world, don't refer to an absolute quality. These things are all known in relation to other things, but unknown of themselves. So when we call something heavy, that is a statement of comparison. It only makes sense in relation to other things which are lighter. And usually even these words, they can get even more relative than the text describes. I guess like when we're talking about relative to a certain domain of activity, right? So what's considered heavy relative to what I can lift with my body versus what I can lift with a forklift? It's a very different definition of heavy. And so we might ask, is anything just intrinsically heavy? Well, compared to what? You can't ever posit the absolute quality of heaviness as a kind of Platonic idea, complete in itself, because the very concept is relational. It's only sensible when it's put forward as a relation. So we know things in relation to others, but not in and of themselves. One final reason for suspending our judgment whenever possible. Now, beyond the tropes given by Pyrrho, there are actually 5 more tropes that we do have to talk about, but I'm not going to spend nearly as much time on them. I'm just going to list them off. These are the tropes added by the student of Pyrrho named Agrippa. We have to consider these because 3 out of the 5 of these tropes, these modes of disputation that Agrippa gives, are now categorized together as Agrippa's trilemma. It seems to me the other 2 modes of disputation, the other 2 tropes, were presumably of equal importance to Agrippa, but the 3 tropes the second, the fourth, and the fifth one, if I remember correctly. These three tropes are the trilemma. They make uncertain pretty much any positive truth claim. That has been the argument of later skeptics, that within these five, Agrippa gives us three that produce this trilemma. And again, Agrippa doesn't use the term, this is my trilemma. He gives them as part of, again, the list of five. It's one of those later terms that we use to identify a concept, sort of like when people talk about Hume's fork, or Hume's guillotine. These are not terms that he used. They're later terms that identify a concept in that work. So the five tropes of Agrippa are: 1, there is no agreement on philosophical issues. Opinions clash, they never produce consensus. Presumably, if humans were able to discover the truth through the clash of opinions, that state of agreement would have been reached, but it has not been. 2, truths are always established by other truths, from premises to conclusions, which makes every truth related to a previous truth, which leads to an infinite regress if we continue asking what each truth is based on, which premises it's supported by. 3, no object is ever perceived independently, but always in relation to other things. From what I can gather, this is basically the same mode as the 10th mode of Pyrrho. 4, axioms are absurd in and of themselves. Any argument which is based on something that we have to assume in order for the argument to be true, that argument has failed to prove anything, because you have to rest it on assumption. And for this trope, I will just quote the text because I think it's helpful. Laertius says that this argument, quote, is directed against those arguers who pretend that it is necessary to accept the principles of things taken absolutely, and that one must place one's faith in them without any examination, which is an absurdity, for one may just as well lay down the opposite principles. End quote. And finally, number 5, this mode is directed at any truths which are based on a circular argument, or begging the question, in which the truth of the conclusion has to be assumed in order to prove it. Laertius says that this type of argument, quote, is capable of application whenever the proof of the truth which we are looking for supposes as a necessary preliminary our belief in that truth. End quote. So 2, 4, and 5 are Agrippa's trilemma, and the claim would be that any dogmatic argument with which you are presented, any proposing of a doctrine or an affirmative judgment, can be subjected to one of these tropes. It will fall victim to one of them. Either they think that they can prove every single proposition they put forward, which requires them to put forward another proposition to support the previous one, and that can go on forever as an infinite regress. Or they'll have to appeal to an axiom, a brute fact, that they say we all have to presuppose and not subject it to reason. Or they'll eventually rest their conclusion upon a previous proposition, which assumes what they're trying to prove, and rather than let their chain of syllogisms reach back into an infinity, they tie it off into a circle, so to speak. And frankly, I find the trilemma at least a little bit convincing. The ground you stand on in attempting to justify any affirmative claim, any absolute certainty, will always be an infinite regress, a circle, or an axiom. And none of these are rational. In fact, they're all absurd. And so we might wonder what kinds of extravagant negations these skeptics were inspired to make following from these tropes. What arguments did they make following from these modes of disputation? What type of worldview was generated out of this method of engagement? Laertius writes, quote, as to man himself, he disagrees both with himself and with others, as the diversity of laws and customs proves. The senses are deceivers, and reason disagrees with itself. End quote. And so accordingly, he writes that the skeptics denied many things. They denied the possibility of signs or signifiers. The skeptics denied causality. They denied motion. They denied the possibility of learning. And finally, they denied morality itself, or at least any realist account of morality. The skeptics argued, quote, that there is no such thing as any natural good or natural evil. For if there be any natural good or natural evil, then it must be good to everyone, or evil to everyone, just as snow is cold to everyone. But there is no such thing as one general good or evil which is common to all beings. Therefore, there is no such thing as any natural good or natural evil, for either one must pronounce everything good, which is thought so by any one whatever, or one must say that it does not follow that everything which is thought good is good. End quote. Now, if any of these denials, any of these negative positions, become taken as truths, they become affirmative judgments. And that's a contradiction, yet again. And so I don't think it's necessary for us to consider these positions as definitive of the skeptics. Perhaps we might say that these rejections come out of the claim that the equal and opposite proposition is always just as likely. So even if it is a affirmative position to say, for example, learning is impossible, we might say that, again, perhaps the skeptics are presenting these arguments because in the same manner that Gorgias presents his arguments against existence contra Parmenides, it would seem all the philosophers would say that learning is possible. It seems to be a sort of dogmatic certainty. Therefore, let us assert the opposite. Let us reject that possibility. All the world seems to think that there is some sort of natural good or natural evil. Therefore, let us assert the opposite. And for all these radical rejections, we have to remember once again that the skeptics were known primarily for their tranquility. They were the last people to offend or to rudely contradict others. Pyrrho himself never acted imprudently. He lived to a ripe old age. And this description also applies when we look to the figures they influenced after the birth of continental philosophy. We've already mentioned David Hume, who seems to judge Pyrrho unfairly, but nevertheless Hume is the very picture of a tranquil skeptic. But I think the real successor to Pyrrho in the modern era is a man who lived hundreds of years before Hume, Michel de Montaigne, who lived by the sayings of the Peronian skeptics, particularly their sayings which emphasize ephektos, suspension of judgment. Among the mantras of Montaigne are, "The for and against are both possible. I determine nothing. I do not comprehend things. I suspend judgment. I examine." Finally, there is the phrase that adorned Montaigne's library, "What do I know?" Words to live by for a skeptic. Montaigne argued ferociously against claims of certainty, including certainty about human ignorance. How do we know that we will never know? We don't, and therefore we should even suspend our judgment about the necessity of suspending judgment. That is a classic Pyrrhonian skeptic position, and Montaigne brings it into the modern era. And so, as a final note, I just feel compelled to say, at this point, that I can't help but kind of chuckle to myself whenever I hear someone going on and on about how cultural or moral relativism is some new phenomenon, how it's such a shocking development that there are people around who will claim that they don't believe in truth. Maybe this was cooked up in the counterculture of the 1960s. Maybe it's an invention of the universities and the postmodernists. Maybe it's a sign of the nihilism of our times. But no, skeptical arguments, relativistic arguments, these are nothing new in the history of Western culture. In fact, skepticism goes back to the very foundations. In the time of the ancient Greeks, we already had critiques of language. We had critiques of the possibility of conveying truth through language. We had perspectival arguments. We had relativistic arguments. We had the practice of counterposing antithetical perspectives. And we have examples of philosophers like Pyrrho, like Timon, like Agrippa, and Sextus Empiricus, who taught the power of suspending judgment, and they drew upon the wisdom of their own literary canon and previous philosophers who had extolled the virtues of withholding judgment and mused on the foolishness and the fallibility of man, who seems so secure in his certainties, possessed of a kind of hubris that would make him think that he could enlighten his fellow men by speaking the truth in dialogue. Pyrrho would have laughed at that and suggested instead a healthy dose of adiaphora. And we don't have to limit this to the Greeks, by the way. As I was working on this episode, my mind kept returning to some of my favorite words from all of world literature. A favorite passage that has become something of a cliche, or at least certain parts of the passage have. But I'll always love these verses, and even though this technically has nothing to do with Pyrrho, I suppose it goes a little bit of the way in showing that this spirit of skepticism is expressed throughout our whole culture, not just from Athens, but also from Jerusalem. This is Ecclesiastes 1:1, Quote, "The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly, but I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." End quote. The pursuit of wisdom, the pursuit of perhaps the criterion of judging, of knowing true from false, that brings Ataraxia, disturbance, grief. The abandonment of the pursuit, the suspension of judgment, brings ataraxia, tranquility. There is nothing new under the sun. Skepticism was here already long ago. It was here before our time. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.